This is an INGENIUM University podcast.
Welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the INGENIUM podcast. Up until now, everyone we've featured on this podcast has come from an INGENIUM university. But of course, we're all meeting peers and colleagues from outside of our alliance all of the time at conferences and elsewhere. And those encounters give us a chance to hear different approaches and new perspectives on learning and teaching. So in this episode, we thought we'd branch out a little and speak to someone outside the alliance to bring in some new ideas. This conversation came about through Tom, who was in Crete in May 2025 for the International Conference on Inclusive Student-Centred Pedagogy. The event was hosted by the University of Crete, and while some INGENIUM members attended, it wasn't an INGENIUM event in itself. There, Tom met Lauren Flannery from the University of East Anglia, and that connection eventually led to this conversation earlier this year. Lauren is a specialist speech and language therapist and lecturer in the School of Health Sciences at the University of East Anglia. She holds a university teaching fellowship in inclusive education and is project lead for the Communication Access Project at UEA, which works to improve communication accessibility across the university. Lauren is also an advocate for inclusion and accessibility in higher education and chairs the School of Health Sciences Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee at UEA. She's particularly interested in teacher-student relationships in higher education. That's the focus of her PhD, and she leads several research projects on communication access, inclusivity, relational pedagogy, and belonging, including an impact evaluation project on relational pedagogy itself. It was this idea of relational pedagogy that really caught our interest, so we began by asking Lauren to explain what relational pedagogy means and why it matters for those of us working in higher education.
Yeah, sure. So for me, relational pedagogy is very much thinking about relationships, connections, and care as core aspects of our work as higher education professionals. And I think it's very much thinking of relational pedagogy as that intentional practice of teaching through relationship. So not just thinking about the content. So how do we show up? How do we deliver? Thinking about our presence in the classroom space, in our different learning environments, how we are tuning to our students, how are we communicating, how basically are we co-creating this climate, if you like, where students can all genuinely thrive. And I think for all students, particularly those first transitioning into higher education, that teacher-student relationship is really key. And it's a real source of kind of stability to motivation and to their confidence. And I often come back to that question around that students might ask of, am I safe here? Do I feel safe here? And I think that comes long before what can I learn here? So for me, relational pedagogy and those relationships can act as a real protective factor for students and those coming into higher education.
And why do you think, Lauren, why do you think there's more of a focus on it in today's world, or why do you think there's more of a need for this kind of relational pedagogy and positive relationships in today's higher education environment?
So I think we have become an extremely fast-moving society where we have answers at our fingertips. We're always on technology. We're often, standing in a supermarket queue. How many people get their phone out to quickly check an email whilst they're waiting for their turn? Back in the day, I say back in the day, that makes me sound like 105, but you might well have turned around and smiled at somebody or frowned at somebody for what's on in their trolley. But we're often head down, maybe missing those moments of connection and seeing what else is going on around us. And I think that for me, because of the nature of pace in higher education and how in certain instances, I think transactional it's become, where students come, they're paying fees, they want to leave with a good degree or a good, qualification. It's more important than ever, I think, for us to be connecting and ensuring that we don't lose sight of the human and the human approach behind the learning that we're doing. Because, as I say, if we don't feel safe in those classrooms, then often we can see with our students that they don't turn up, or they drop out because they maybe aren't feeling like this is the place for them. So we know that those relationships really predict outcomes. we see this across different disciplines. And when students feel seen, when they feel supported, when they feel like we care about them, we know that their engagement increases, that retention improves, their well-being is strengthened, and their academic confidence grows.
Lauren, you've done a nice description there of the importance and why creating these safe, inclusive environments, has so many positive outcomes for the student. And I love your kind of line there about kind of students feeling safe as a priority and paramount to the work you do. So can you give us some examples, some simple actions that maybe some of the educators listening to this podcast can do that can have that impact on students' sense of belonging and confidence?
Yeah, so I think what's really key here is actually looking at what's already going really well. I think as humans, if we try and look for the strengths and build on those, then we tend to have more success. We tend to go straight for the negative as well, instead of recognizing the things that are going well. But I think for me, that relational pedagogy is really built on those small, intentional and authentic actions with our students. So, using names, using their pronouns correctly, greeting students in a friendly manner at the start of a session, checking in with them, noticing when our students are clearly not feeling okay in those spaces. I think as well, normalizing the uncertainty and the struggle within some of the work that we do. I certainly know for me that learning is a continual journey and we don't always get it right. And sometimes, we find things really difficult. When we show up in our classroom spaces, we always do our best to show up and bring our best selves. But, sometimes we've not had the best morning ourselves. So I think sometimes just being human about the struggles, but also acknowledge that the topics that they're studying, especially when they're new and new concepts, it's a lot. So I think being really human and normalizing that's important. And sometimes building those predictable structures. So again, students are familiar with what to expect in those learning spaces, I think really help as well. What's come across in the work that I've done is students really talking about, again, that power of presence. So the sense that the educator is there genuinely with them in those moments, even if they're only, touch points across their degree program, because you may have students regularly, or you may only fly in and fly out and see, one class in one particular cohort a couple of times. But that concept of presence and being really in the moment with those students, I think is really important.
I suppose, is there anything else, Lauren, around that space about maybe practices that staff could do? Like, just maybe I think it'd be difficult for staff to see the students as individuals and not just as learners. And I think sometimes, some staff maybe are philosophically the more engaging and build those relationships naturally. But for those staff that maybe don't naturally build those positive relations with students, have you any other nuggets there that they could begin to try and do maybe in their space that might be simple to implement, but might be very important from a student perspective?
Yeah, I think as well, it's recognizing, isn't it, that the students are there as learners, but they're there as whole individuals as well. And it's kind of become popular, this kind of term around kind of student sense of belonging and how they feel kind of at university. And I think it's all linked together and tied up for me with those relationships. But again, belonging being much broader than just feeling comfortable in that classroom space. It's very personal and it looks different for every student. So sometimes it's really difficult offering these kind of one size fits all strategy, because we have to remember that everybody's very unique and everybody, shows up in different ways. And when we're thinking at belonging, the research is really reminding us at the moment that students belong in different ways at different times and in different spaces. And they also have different concepts of belonging and how they want to belong. So there's not one right way. And I think that's important for us to hold on to when we're thinking about practices that can support students. Again, there might not be a one size fits all, but there are often lots of strategies and ways that we can approach things that are helpful for lots of students. So I think inviting students to share their stories and reflect on their identity is really is often very key. But again, there may be students who really don't want to do that. So I think it's about inviting students rather than it being an assumption or an expectation that students should do that. I think always being transparent about the expectations in the learning space that you host is really important, so that students can feel kind of confident. I think there's lots of students that will report feeling like they actually didn't take in lots of the lecture because they were so worried about, being called on in the second part of the lesson or something like that. I think giving small choices to students about how they can navigate that classroom space, and co-creating those sort of ground rules so that every student in the best way can have a voice, but then making it really communication accessible. So we focus heavily on making things kind of really communication accessible here at UEA. But thinking about, again, giving that choice. So sometimes it's about using those anonymous platforms for feedback and for students to give their voice. So whether that's using kind of whiteboards or Post-it notes or Padlets, there are so many tools now available to us. And I think it's really important that we utilize those to allow, as best we can, students and learners the choice in how they want to engage with us. And I think that will support that wider belonging as well.
On the topic of digital tools, because you raised it there. So, within this INGENIUM Alliance, there are 10 universities spread out across Europe. So I guess a lot of what you were talking about there is really in that kind of face-to-face setting, mainly, I guess, kind of in the classroom or in the lecture theatre. But for a lot of the students in INGENIUM, I guess, kind of picking up on your idea of belonging there, there's a couple of levels of belonging. Their personal belonging, there's their belonging to their own institution, and then there's their belonging to this INGENIUM Alliance. And often they're in classrooms that are online, so it's distance learning or online learning based. So like, for example, some of the courses would be these blended intensive programs or BIPs, where they might have, 8 lectures over a semester of lectures all online. And then they might have an in-person week where they kind of all come together and they do some kind of lab-based work. I'm just kind of wondering what your advice would be for that more online or distance learning model as opposed to the face-to-face model.
I am really fortunate because I teach across pre and post-reg provision, one that's kind of more face-to-face, traditional, if you like, in person. And then the other part of my job is fully online because our learners join from often very busy kind of acute hospital settings as healthcare professionals. And I have found that it's just about being really clear about what the intention is behind the activity in terms of how you then present that to the students to allow that engagement. So online, I might, for example, if I'm asking a question, I might have a blank whiteboard as well as an opportunity to invite students to have cameras and mics on, as well as having the chat function. So there are multiple ways that those students can engage. And I think, again, it's about us being really responsible and reflecting on the assumptions that we sometimes have about students and their level of engagement because cameras are on or off, or their mics are on or off. I had an example where I was actually being observed by a colleague in one of my teaching sessions, just as part of our usual kind of university procedures. And I had a slide where I was asking, inviting students if they wanted to share. We were doing some sort of looking at different personality traits, and they had the opportunity to tick or put a dot on the slide for where what they wanted to share in terms of their personality. And all of a sudden, these dots just appeared, masses of them. And yet there weren't very many students, just a handful. I maybe had 30 on the call, and there was maybe only 2 or 3 that had cameras on. And my colleague, and I do this all the time, so I hadn't reflected on it much, but my colleague afterwards said she could not believe how many dots suddenly appeared. And it, for her, was a real moment of reflection of, wow, I just assumed that people weren't, really particularly engaged in that session. But she said because you offered them a totally different way to what she had thought in her sessions of doing, it really showed they were engaged. So I think there's an element with online that we perhaps think that if they don't have cameras and mics on, that they're not particularly engaged in the session. I think sometimes it's thinking outside the box of how can we make this more inclusive? How can we see how people want to engage? It depends on the sessions, but I do use quite a lot of the poll functions as well, just to check in with people. Sometimes that'll be at the beginning of a session to do a bit of a kind of like, let's reset and get back into what we were thinking about last time. What have you held on to? I'll often as well use the whiteboard. I mean, my students laugh because my drawings are absolutely horrific. But I might just do something really simple as well, of just doing a 1 to 5 scale on the screen and saying, and particularly if we're coming up to something like a formative or a summative assessment, and just saying, just let me know on this scale of 1 to 5, and I'll have a really poorly drawn smiley face or sad face at one end of the scale, of saying, how are you feeling about this assessment coming up? And if they're saying that they're like a 2 or a 3, I'm like, okay, so that's great. Thank you for sharing. Now tell me, what can I do today to move you from a 2 to a 3 or 3 to a 4? I'm not trying to go from a 2 to a 5. Let's be realistic. I've only got 50 minutes. We're maybe only going to have 10 minutes to talk about this. But actually, what can I do that's going to help you? And then I ask, and what can you do that's going to help you get from that 3 to the 5? And think about that kind of learner agency as well. And then I'll offer that at the end of the session and see. And again, I don't have the ability there. It's anonymous. I'm not calling anyone out, but I can then see, a general shift to see whether things have moved, and therefore whether I feel that session has maybe been useful. So I think sometimes it's about just thinking through, and the more that you do it, the more that you try, those things now don't take any more time for me, and they're just kind of inherent in that practice. But I think because it's new and it's different, we can naturally, as you would expect with humans, feel a bit scared about trying those things.
Some really nice ideas there. And I think in our alliance, English is the first language, but it's a secondary language for most of the other universities. So yeah, having those kind of interactions where they can just add something to a rating scale or use polls and stuff, that's a really nice way of helping those who might be a little hesitant to kind of turn their mics on. Yeah, really, really nice.
Yeah, and I think like the higher education, I suppose in general, it's a very diverse student presenting in higher education, and I think the INGENIUM, alliance is no different there. But so, what are some of the barriers, Lauren, that you see that maybe kind of that students face, in terms of engaging maybe in higher education, and what advice then would you give to lecturers or educators on the ground to maybe see where they could support and try and remove some of those barriers in their everyday teaching?
Yeah, so I guess in my experience with obviously being a speech and language therapist by trade, I've focused on how accessible kind of we are from a communication perspective at UEA. And I think what I found most is that the barriers that students face are not very often about ability, they're about access. So a lot of the teaching environments, whether online or face-to-face, are too fast or too dense or too overwhelming for whatever reason. And it makes it then difficult for those learners to really, truly participate. So sometimes it's because the speech rate is too rapid. And I think we're all guilty of that, particularly when we're getting excited or we're worried about time pressures. When our slides are too crammed with too much information, because again, we're worried about trying to get everything across in one go. Or perhaps when those discussions, we try and do those group activities or get that interaction, but they kind of get dominated by the loudest voices in the room. So I think sometimes it's about thinking about the solutions that are the most simple. So actually for educators, can we slow down a little bit? Can we just reduce our pace? Can we think about breaking information into chunks? And can we think about, do we really need to give all this information all in this one go? Or can we do like a little 20-minute kind of recorded presentation, or have a discussion about that at another time? And I think clear signposting as well, so saying to the students, first of all, we're going to do this, and then after that we're going to move on to this, or these are the 3 tasks we're going to be covering today. I think those building in those small pauses though, and I often, even if I'm online, I will always try and make sure that we've got some sort of movement break in the middle, or just have a pause where I'm saying, right, I'm just giving you a moment now to digest what's been said, have a bit of time for maybe thinking or a question, because I think we are, all of us, I think, guilty about being on the hamster wheel. I say it's like being on a hamster wheel where you rush all the time, or spinning many plates. And we're used to kind of joining meetings whilst answering emails or checking our phone. And the students are kind of used to that as well. And sometimes it's just giving everybody permission to just like have 2 minutes to just stop and process and think about what's been happening. I think widening the ways, like I said, in which students can communicate with us really helps with some of those barriers. So thinking about the different chat functions or Padlets we use, or just the old-fashioned, like, this is my post box today, which will be like an old shoebox, but you can write anything on a piece of scrap of paper or post it and leave it for me, so if it's that you want to share something or tell me something, that didn't work well or that did work well. So I think all of those things are really helpful. And I think it's tiny shifts in habits as educators that are most helpful rather than big redesigns. And as part of the communication access training that we've undertaken, they've got a really lovely acronym that I think when you think about reducing barriers is really, really helpful. And it's the TALK acronym, TLALK. And it stands for T for time. So give people more time, like we've said, whether that's adding pauses. A is for ask. So just ask. Ask the students or ask the person who you're communicating with how you can help. L, which is the listen. So let's look, listen, appreciate what people are saying and actually hear what they're saying to us. And then the K, which is the keep trying. So if something doesn't work the first time, let's not give up. Let's have another go.
I just want to pick up on one or two things there, Lauren, you were saying, I think, because there's a lot of what you're saying kind of resonates around the kind of universal design around multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement. So, it's good to hear that. And I suppose even the piece you mentioned about the chunking, kind of the educational theory around that, about chunking information. So, yeah, it's good to hear you talk about those and the importance of those in terms of creating that environment that all can engage in. We'd like to maybe talk a little bit about the course that you're leading around the heart of teaching, that Future Learn course. And I attended a conference in Crete that you presented a workshop on, and you did an excellent job there in kind of sharing the learnings from that course and what people have got from it. So I'd like maybe to ask you maybe what insights that you've got from that project and engaging with people that you think has transformed how maybe some of those participants and teachers think about relationships with their students. What have you got what have you heard back from those people that have completed your course that's have an impact?
So I think it's been so exciting because this course has actually had engagement from over 1,000 participants now. So it's grown even more since we chatted in Crete. And it's reached over 100 countries across the globe. So it's brilliant to see what kind of insights have been coming through. And we obviously did a bit of a pilot on the data, and we're going to have to go back because there's so much data there for us to pick up on. But what we what keeps coming through again and again is, firstly, educators realizing that those small moments matter most. So again, going back to that, relational pedagogy isn't about those big gestures or extra workload. It's about those tiny everyday interactions that build that trust. So using a student's name, pausing to check in, showing warmth. We had one participant say, and I quote, I used to think connection would take time away from content, but now I see it actually helps learning happen. I was like, wow. Yeah. So actually noticing the difference, that rather than just like thinking, oh, we've got to get through all this content, I'm just going to try and do this like really transactional, here I stand, give, actually recognizing that with connecting with those students, that learning lands and they receive that learning. And actually that's been really transformational. Secondly, there was a really big shift in self-awareness. So again, educators really reflecting on their own habits, their own assumptions, their communication styles. And many were noticing perhaps an increase in awareness of their own biases and noticing how they show up in the classroom and how that helped them create more inclusive environments. Another participant had said, teaching isn't just transferring knowledge, it's building connections that empower students to reach their full potential. And I think that goes back to connecting with what we said about if those students are feeling safe, then they're going to feel ready to learn. And if they feel that's really supported, we can get them energized. Yeah, for us, we've stayed in this game for a long time. We love this learning. And I think it is this exciting roller coaster of a journey. But in order for students to feel enticed to get on the ride with us, they need to feel that there is some safety element there and there is some fun. They appreciate there'll be highs and lows along the journey. But I think, it is important to recognize that we're there as guides, if you like, and facilitators along that. And thirdly, the course really showed how universal this work is. So as I said, we've touched kind of over 100 countries now. Educators from across the globe are really sharing that this sense of belonging, this sense of safety and connection are all things that students need, no matter their educational context or culture. And many were also saying that this relational practice really improved their own sense of well-being. It reduced conflict in the classroom, if you like, and it reminded them why they love teaching, because they were getting that connection. And as humans, that's what we thrive on, right? It's connecting with others. And one comment that really stayed with me was when a participant had said, "It's genuinely transformed how I see my teaching. It's helped me understand why I do what I do." And I thought, wow, again, that's just like suckers you in the heart, doesn't it? So I think the biggest insight for me with all the kind of data coming in is that relational pedagogy is that simple and very human, but deeply impactful kind of work for students and for educators.
It says a lot about the educators too, that they're reflexive enough to kind of think about what they do and, how they might change it and maybe slow down, like you said, just to make that extra time to communicate more with the students. So yeah, that's really nice outcomes.
Yeah, and we'll put a link to the Future Learner course, the Art of Teaching, in the show notes there. So if people want to kind of delve a bit further into it and maybe experience what some of you talked about there, I think it's an opportunity for them to do that. So it's really nice to hear that. We're with the INGENIUM Alliance, Lauren, I suppose the 10 universities, it's maybe up at the higher level. So maybe moving out of the classroom and maybe moving to a higher level in terms of the management of the universities. How do you think kind of universities like the INGENIUM Alliance can support staff to kind of build relationships, without maybe adding to the kind of the workload that we talked about and the intense environment sometimes that academics work in?
Yeah, so as I've said, I think that the most effective relational practice that we embody, if you like, can sit beautifully within the work that educators are already doing. And I think that the universities and the alliances like INGENIUM can play a really supportive role here. I think it's about embedding these practices into existing structures. We don't need to be creating new layers. We don't need to be reinventing the wheel. I think it's about noticing the everyday tasks that we can just make small tweaks to. So the way we give feedback, the way we open a lecture, the tone that we use in our emails. I always think, when you get that email that really sends you your blood boiling or your heart racing, maybe don't respond for the next hour, give yourself a chance to re-regulate. It's about the predictability, I think, that we build into our teaching and our modules. So none of that really needs to require extra time, just perhaps that different lens. And I think offering the development opportunities, it feels at the moment that educators are really calling out for this kind of professional development. And I think it needs to be accessible, and I think it needs to be immediately useful. So platforms like Future Learn are great because obviously you can jump on when it suits you. You don't have to be going on at a particular time or in a particular location. And you can pause things. So I think any of those kind of micro credentials are useful. And those kind of short courses, but giving staff those really practical tools, but also building what's been brilliant on the Future Learn platform is that educators have really built a platform and a community together to kind of share some of this. So you can see them sharing examples of good practice and when things haven't worked as well. And I think when, as a collective looking at institutions, if we can reduce barriers and share again where we've made communication better, when we've made those feedback loops more efficient, then we can copy it. Again, I don't think we need to be reinventing the wheel. And we know, all of us can recognise when the cognitive load is lower for us, for both students and for staff, it frees up headspace and heart space, if you like, for us to really be authentic and genuine in our human connections. So I think it's really about enabling, not adding. And creating those conditions where the relational practices that we're talking about become the norm and not seen as a burden.
And I wonder then, so I guess that's kind of talking about the staff and how they can do things, but do you think that the institutions themselves, like these big institutions, these big alliances of 10 universities, do you think they can play a role in spreading these kind of inclusive and relational practices internationally? Are there organizations? I don't know what role can the institution play, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I just think it's how we learn from each other and how we connect. Again, for me, it comes back to those relationships. So actually, even as big institutions, how are we connecting? To me, it's pointless if every institution is working alone. We know what works, for our students generally. And I think it's this INGENIUM network is a shared space where these great ideas can just travel much more quickly. And I think common approaches to things. So, everybody kind of being aware of what we mean by relational pedagogy and seeing it as important, so that then as well, our students that maybe have opportunities to travel across the Alliance and go and experience something in another institution, they've kind of got that consistency and they kind of understand how they're going to be supported and spoken to in those kind of different institutions. There is so much brilliant work happening in pockets of different institutions. And sometimes I just wish we had more time to connect and press pause and do those things. And we know that when we do that, and we have this time, so, when me and Tom managed to get to Crete together and then connect, like, look at the great exciting things that happen from those conversations. But sometimes it's real effort to take a step back and go, no, I'm jumping off the hamster wheel, or I'm just going to drag my foot along the floor to slow it down a little bit for the next month, so that we can take advantage of some of those opportunities. Because the more that we can share these ideas across these alliances, then the better. And again, I think if we can support staff development across these networks without adding extra pressure or workload, because you can house them under one umbrella, so people can just jump in and pick and choose what's useful to them at the time, then again, that would be really, really helpful. And I'm hoping that an alliance like INGENIUM, is potentially going to have the influence to encourage shifts in policy that value this relational and inclusive work as core parts of quality education. Because I think if we're working together, I always say, stronger together. But if we're growing this work and doing this work together with students and learners across the alliance, then we're going to achieve much more than what a single university could achieve on its own. Would be my thoughts.
Thanks, Lauren. I want to bring you back to your analogy of the roller coaster. And I love that about making students feel safe and, the highs and lows of this exciting learning journey that we're all on. So my question is back to the student then, the student that presents in a classroom, goes into a higher education setting. What can they do to help themselves? Or what advice would you give to students, that maybe are concerned or, don't feel safe or, need more support? What advice would you give to those students?
I think it's, make a real effort to find your people. So, whether it can be really hard at first, but I think it's about being kind to yourself, that it takes time to sometimes feel settled. But I think it's really important to try and take advantage of all the opportunities provided. Our institutions now have a wealth of different support networks and resources and different student groups. So if you're not finding your people naturally within your, the classrooms that you're in, if you like, are there other groups where you can find your people? Because I always say, you only need a couple of very good friends. And as you get older, you tend to not lose, but you have your core group and then you have your friends on the periphery. And it only takes, I think, one or two really strong connections, whether that be with peers or with staff, to start that ripple effect. And I think sometimes it's those small moments. So even if you're feeling really, really nervous and feeling really anxious or not feeling like you belong in that space or that you matter in that space, if you can show up and try your hardest to just have a neutral or a smile, or that you open the door for the next person behind you and, dare to kind of give that bit of eye contact if that feels comfortable for you, to just invite some connection. It's amazing how quickly I think the ripple effect of something that feels really small, but might feel big in terms of a big move to start with, can have a really big ripple effect. So I think for students, it's about being open to showing up in spaces that might feel scary, taking advantage of opportunities, but also taking advantage of the opportunities where you're asked for feedback. Because in my experience at the moment, students are probably getting kind of fatigue from being asked for so much feedback because, we ask them all the time. But if they can give that feedback in a, friendly, critical friend, shall we say, way, then actually they will hopefully feel that we're being really responsive in trying to create the best environment that we can for everybody. But again, we're not always going to get it right. So I think it's about owning the mistakes and just working together to create something magical, a magical roller coaster ride for us all.
So that was Lauren Flannery from the University of East Anglia, A big thank you to Lauren for taking the time to speak to us for the INGENIUM podcast. It was great to hear from her about the idea of relational pedagogy and how we can strengthen those student-teacher relationships, both in the lecture room and online. That is all for this episode. Speak to you in the next one.